Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, Assistant Sports Editor for Multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State chat by Joel Haas of the Daily Collegian and the Post-Gazette. We're going to be getting into some James Franklin. Does he deserve more credit for where Penn State is in this playoff conversation? Looking like if they're able to finish at 11-1, they'll be safely in. They're not among these teams that are really fretting hard about their resumes. And, of course, still has issues with winning the big game, but after all that, he has put Penn State in a solid position. Talk a little bit more about him. Talk about this playoff race in general. These arguments that are unfolding online and on various TV programs about who belongs in this playoff, who does not, how the conferences stack up against each other. Also be talking a little bit of Tyler Warren. How can you not, after his another dominant performance this past week at Purdue? Can he be the focal point of a legit national championship threat team? Maybe get into some Luke Reynolds, some Beau Pribula. Before we do, just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast. It's Voodoo Brewing Company, State College. Enjoy world-renowned craft beer, delicious cocktails, and our almost famous lobster rolls at Voodoo Brewing Company, State College Pub, located right off College Avenue and Route 322 at 201 Elmwood Street. State College, VBC has something exciting going on every day of the week. Join us this fall on Mondays for weekly free play cornhole tournaments or test your knowledge with pub trivia every Tuesday at 6. Wednesday is our game night featuring board games, card games, and adult games. Every Thursday, your boy Dots hosts bingo, and this is not your Nana's bingo. Saturday, we have your Nittany Lions and college football on all day. We finish off Sundays with our weekly brunch paired with Steelers, Eagles, and Red Zone coverage. Can't wait to see you at the VBC State College Pub. All right, Joel, let's get into this, what I set up at the top. I'll just keep it simple. Does James Franklin deserve more credit? Because I look around the landscape, and I think Penn State would be really in the thick of these arguments if they had a second loss. The fact that they're not is really a leg up. I think it's reasonable to say that Penn State might not get in at 10-2 with the way this bubble is shaking up, with how many of these SEC teams are there. And, amid all of that, James Franklin has kept his team focused, has not taken that second loss like a lot of these SEC teams have against inferior competition. The job is not done. You still need to win these last two games to get to 11-1. They're not layups, I don't think, against Purdue and Maryland. Not great teams, but Penn State probably can't, take them too lightly. We know Minnesota has disrupted important Penn State seasons in the past. So, what's your view on where things kind of stand with James Franklin right now? Obviously, there was a lot of heat after that Ohio State game, but I look at the way they've played, dominated Purdue, dominated Washington. It looks like he's kept this team motivated and with the eyes on doing something come December and January.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you look at what he's been able to do these last 3 years specifically, where he's never lost as a favorite in these last 3 seasons. And obviously he's had 6 losses, 5 of them against Ohio State and Michigan, and he was the underdog in each of those games. And so Penn State pretty much has, gone chalk every week. And there's something to be said for that consistency. And I think a lot of it goes back to Franklin's, 1-0 mentality, which, obviously it's a cliche and it's something that anyone who's ever played sports has heard, from their coaches at some point. And, there's a lot of other coaches around the country who do that, but I don't know if any team does it to the level that Penn State does and that Penn State has under Franklin. It's definitely, embedded into the players' heads from the moment they step on campus. And every time we get a media with a player, they'll repeat kind of the same thing. You try to ask Franklin about, the Maryland game in 2 weeks, or if you try to ask him about the playoffs after that, he's not going to answer. He's going to tell you, the team is only focused on Minnesota right now, and they want to go 1-0 on Saturday, which is, the mindset they have every week. And I think that helps in terms of avoiding an upset because, you're never going to overlook an opponent like, for example, Purdue last Saturday. Penn State was ready to play in that game, came out firing, kind of dominated that one from start to finish, which obviously is expected because, Purdue's now 1-9 and not a good team, but there are other teams around the country. Like you mentioned, I mean, Alabama lost to Vanderbilt this season, and I think Ole Miss lost to Kentucky, and there are some pretty bad losses, for some of those other top teams that are kind of in that playoff argument. And Penn State doesn't seem to ever pick up those games. I mean, you can pinpoint a few throughout Franklin's tenure, but for the most part, they come ready to play. And again, I think that 1-0 mentality of, not overlooking any opponent gets them prepared, and they're never going to, kind of drop down and have that high variance where, they can come out and lay an egg in these games. But at the same time, if you're, trying to treat every opponent like it's the same. And then you go against Ohio State and all of a sudden, you get punched right out of the gate and you're not really sure how to respond. You're not sure what to do. And, if you've only been taking each opponent 1 week at a time, well, you've only been preparing for Ohio State for 1 week and you have, the same amount of preparation and the same level of preparation that you had for Purdue is the same amount that you have for Ohio State. Now, all of a sudden you come into that game and you look underprepared against the Buckeyes. And so I think it all goes back to that kind of strategy that Franklin has implemented where, they're not going to lose to the teams that are worse than them, but they're also not going to jump up and have a great game against a team that's better than them. And, obviously there's like trade-offs there. If you wanted to say, hey, we need to be locked in on Ohio State and maybe do what Michigan does, where you have this big countdown timer in the facility for that game. And, you have it circled every year and stuff like that. You could do that. You could put more of an emphasis on that game, more focus on that game. You could do more game planning in the weeks leading up, even, when you're facing a different opponent or something like that, and potentially give yourself a better chance to beat Ohio State. But the risk of that obviously is if you're not paying attention to other opponents, you risk getting upset and suffering losses to inferior teams, which can obviously hurt the resume. So I think that's just kind of the position that Penn State's in right now, where, if you want to take that approach of going 1-0, which, some people are in favor of, some people are probably opposed to it. But if you want to take that approach, you're going to beat the teams you're supposed to, and you're probably going to lose, to the teams that you're supposed to lose to. So.
Well, here's my read on the situation, though, Joel, because I think of his comments after Ohio State where, a lot of people didn't want to hear it at the moment. And I think it was probably a little tone deaf of him to say, well, it's a new college football landscape. We can move on from this and have an opportunity to make this right. I didn't like that comment at the time, to be completely honest with you, but I think back to it now and the way that they have played. I know he says 1-0, but I think in that comment, he wasn't just talking to the fans. He was talking to his own locker room. And I think kind of setting this big picture for them without getting too focused on any one team, getting too far ahead of themselves of saying, listen, if you do the right things, the season's not over. You lost this team by a touchdown. It's probably one of the best teams in the country. You'll have a chance to redeem yourselves. And it seems that Penn State's playing in a confident way late in the season that I can't really remember them playing since 2016 when they had that Big Ten championship, in front of them. And it looks like this is a motivated group that still wants to get better every week. Do I have the right read on that? Or is it just a matter of they played teams that they're better than and now class them?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. We've talked, on this podcast before about, Penn State has come out really slow in a lot of these games and kind of looked iffy at times in certain areas and maybe, struggled with penalties or whatever it may be. And there's obviously been, some issues that you could point to throughout the season. And we kind of talked about it on here that, if you haven't fixed it through 8, 9, 10 weeks of the season, when are you going to get it fixed? Well, apparently the answer was week 9, week 10 right now, because Penn State has seemingly kind of fixed some of those issues that were plaguing it early in the season. Obviously, it took a while to kind of correct, but I think you could partly attribute that to the loss being, kind of waking the team up a little bit. And I think they're a little bit more focused coming out of that. They know what they have to do. And obviously, like you touched on a little bit earlier, if Penn State, loses a second game, there's a good chance they get bumped out of the playoffs entirely. Just because of, the way things are shaping up, especially with a bunch of those SEC teams with 1 or 2 losses kind of in contention right now. And so if you're Penn State, your back's kind of against the wall. Obviously, this is an expanded playoff. You have your best chance to make the playoff that you've ever had. And if you want to do that, you have to be able to take care of business and you have to kind of lock in. And obviously, if you slip up here against one of these inferior teams, it's not going to be, a good look for your resume or anything like that. And you probably get bounced from the playoffs. And so I think Penn State has looked really good these last couple of weeks. You can attribute it to a few things. I think it's important to note that Nick Singleton's health, he appears to be a little bit healthier. I also think after that, goal line fiasco against Ohio State, that Penn State has made more of a commitment to using Tyler Warren, especially in key situations. And I think it's, paid off for them. I also just think they've come out and looked better to start these games. 4 straight touchdowns against Washington and however many, I think 2 straight against Purdue to open the game. And so obviously Penn State has looked really good coming out of the gate, which is important and was one of the big knacks on the team throughout the start of the season. So I think it's definitely fair to say, that this team shows a resemblance to that Big Ten championship team. And obviously if there was no conference realignment this year, and if Oregon was still in the Pac-12, then Penn State would be in contention for that second spot behind Ohio State this year. And then barring the result between Ohio State and Indiana, we could have seen Penn State in a Big Ten championship game. But with Oregon joining the conference, obviously they get bumped down a level. But in a different year with the traditional, I say traditional, but there's always been shuffling within the conference. But if it was like it was for the last decade, Penn State would be right in the Big Ten title race right now. So.
Yeah, certainly. Joel, I wanted to ask you this. How important in that context is it for Penn State to dominate Minnesota and Maryland these next couple of weeks and keep that narrative that we're talking about going, such that you don't end up in these debates, between a 2-loss SEC team and them? Because I listened a little bit to the college football playoff rankings show last night. Word Manual was interviewed on how they judge things, and I always find that much more interesting than what any of the ex-jocks are saying, because I think Joey Galloway has been petulant this entire time about what happened. He was still bringing up Florida State last night and saying Indiana should sit their quarterback this weekend. Crazy stuff. So that's why I like to hear what they're actually talking about in the committee room. And Word Manual said the watching the games does matter, and the results of the game matter, and how these teams look matters. So in that context, if Penn State wants to host a home game, I think they're still in pole position. I would be surprised even if they won both of these next two games by 1 point if they didn't get it, but I would not be surprised if they ended up in a debate. So do you want to just remove all doubt, and dominate these next two opponents? Is that still important and more than just winning these games?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly important. You'd obviously like to win by a larger margin of victory and, cover the spread and things like that. But I tend to agree with your point that even if Penn State kind of squeaks through these last 2 weeks and wins by one score, I mean, they're still sitting at 11-1 with a very quality loss to Ohio State. And I think it would be really hard for the committee to really, really punish them for, winning games, even if they do so in kind of an ugly manner. I think they would still probably be able to clinch a home playoff game. If not, they would probably, have a first round road trip. I mean,
there's just going to be a lot of noise, and the SEC fans have been working the refs. It's like the memo went out at the beginning of last week to just start working the refs. And I have a conspiracy theory, Joel, that it's not even just about this year for them, because the Big Ten is historically well positioned here, where most of their top 4 teams are not playing each other, other than all of them played Ohio State. But Penn State doesn't play Indiana or Oregon. Oregon doesn't play Indiana or Penn State. It seems like the PR machine is getting fired up, and I just wonder if Penn State doesn't look great these next couple of weeks, if they end up in that situation where working the refs maybe has an impact on them dropping a seed line or two.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already kind of seen the SEC propaganda machine go into work recently. A lot of talk. I think it was Heather Dinich who suggested that, a 3-loss SEC team should be in the mix for a college football playoff spot. In my mind, 3 losses should be the new 2 losses, where it effectively eliminated you from the 4-team playoff, as Penn State is well aware of. I think 3 losses should kind of be the same standard, the same kind of benchmark, where as soon as you pick up that 3rd loss, you should be effectively eliminated from the playoffs, in my opinion. If you play 12 games and you lose 3 of them, I don't think you have any shot of winning the national championship, and therefore I don't think you have any argument to really be in the playoff, because in my mind, every team in the playoff should at least have some kind of argument, as to why they could potentially win the actual championship, and not just, that they played in a tough conference and, had close losses to good teams or things like that. But yeah, no, I've definitely noticed that. I thought it was, we saw some interesting results. Alabama moves up 3 spots in this week's poll. They actually jumped Miami while Miami was on bye, and Alabama played Mercer this weekend. So I don't know what the committee really saw from the win over Mercer that was enough to jump the Crimson Tide over the Hurricanes. And then we saw Missouri, who lost to South Carolina on Saturday, did not move at all and stayed at number 23 in the rankings, which was a little bit puzzling to me. Obviously, that gives a lot of SEC teams a ranked win still, because there are a few of those top SEC teams who are boasting wins over Missouri. Penn State did get a little bit of a bump with Illinois coming in at number 25, because now the Nittany Lions have a win over a currently ranked team. Obviously, they were number 19 at the time of the game, so that helps Penn State a little bit to now be able to say that it has a pretty dominant ranked win. Obviously, it was only 21-7, so it was only by 14 points. But when you really, dig into that game, you can see that, especially in the second half, Penn State was just the better team, especially in terms of, net success rate and things like that. But I think there's definitely, the SEC, we've definitely heard a lot from them. And I think it's just really hard to judge this year without, one dominant team. I think there's only two undefeated power conference teams, and that's Oregon and Indiana right now. And typically you would expect the SEC to have one or two at this point, and they don't. And SEC fans, will prop that up as being a competitive conference where, anyone can beat anyone, and even the losses are quality losses. So, maybe if Indiana had a loss to Vanderbilt right now, they would be higher in the poll. But I'm just very puzzled by a lot of the things that we've seen from the rankings, specifically, in relation to how the SEC has been ranked.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm willing to consider a 3-loss SEC championship game loser. So let's say you go in with 2 losses to the SEC championship game. You made it through all the tiebreakers. You lose that third game. I'm willing to listen to that conversation, but that's effectively where that ends. I just wonder, should the Big Ten fans be working the refs, and is the relative comfort of the Big Ten's position here where you have 4 teams that are very clearly in the mix and the rest of the conference is not, is whatever propaganda machine they have over in Rosemont, should it be working a little bit harder in case one of these teams takes an unexpected loss? And in case you end up in this situation that the SEC is in next season where the schedule works out such that you start beating each other up and you have a bunch of 2-loss teams getting in, I just wonder if, why people are willing to seemingly just let the SEC dominate the conversation, but that's just kind of the way it's been. Joel, I want to talk a little bit about the team. We'll wrap up with a little more playoff talk at the end. Can Penn State win in the playoffs with a tight end being its most dominant player? I think that's a valid question just because it's not, historically the most explosive position. You don't run your team through a tight end, traditionally, but he does go out there every week, Tyler Warren, and rack up double-digit catches, 200 scrimmage yards sometimes. Do you think the structure of the way this team is built is credible as a national championship threat when he is the guy that opposing teams have to stop, and not like a receiver who can run like a 4.2 or I think we think Penn State's running backs are pretty good in Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, but they're not, transcendent Saquon Barkley-like talents either.
Yeah. I mean, Tyler Warren, it gets talked about all the time, but he's just such a unique player in his ability, what he's able to do. Obviously 800 receiving yards and then another 150 on the ground, and, whatever he is passing as well. And he's just such a versatile weapon that he almost serves as, multiple different players on the field at the same time. And so in that sense, he becomes very hard to guard. And I think it's almost better to have, Tyler Warren as kind of that star as opposed to maybe one wide receiver. Let's say Penn State had like a Jahan Dotson instead of a Tyler Warren, where he's obviously an elite game-changing receiver, but the problem is the defenses can kind of key in on him. You can have him manned up with the top cornerback and maybe put a safety over the top at all times just to kind of watch him, double him a lot. But with Tyler Warren, it's really hard to double team him, because say you want to have, if he splits out wide and you want to have a corner and a safety over him, all of a sudden he motions into the backfield. You don't want to have, your secondary closing in like that. And then all of a sudden you have to switch over to having, maybe a linebacker covering him or something like that. And the way that he kind of moves around the field makes it really difficult to try and cover him with all the different things that he can do. And obviously you can try your best to kind of bottle him up and limit his production. But at the end of the day, like, he's going to get his, it's very hard to stop him just because of all the different things that he can do. And so even if a defense is keying in on him, he's very difficult to just completely take out of the game because of the impact that he has. I do think, having Singleton and Allen in the backfield helps as well because there is somewhat of a running threat and defenses can't totally key in on the pass or something like that. And obviously there are receivers who have, flashed a little bit at times, whether it's the Omari Evans deep ball, which I think the team is still kind of trying to figure some things out there because he's kind of fallen off a little bit. We saw a few deep shots early in the season, then we haven't seen much from him. But, Allar has talked about it. Franklin has talked about it. They are calling plays for Evans. Like, they've schemed up deep balls to Evans where he's in one-on-one coverage. and he just hasn't, for whatever reason, been able to get open in those situations. And Allar, has talked about it. He kind of has to check out of it and hit the check down, whether it's Singleton releasing out of the backfield or whatever it may be. But they have been scheming up plays for Evans, and if a defense gets caught kind of lacking and keying in on the run game or on Tyler Warren or whatever it may be, Omari Evans is a guy that can burn you. Harrison Wallace obviously has been pretty reliable, especially the last couple of weeks. I think he's been a little bit more consistent with his play. So, to your original point, like obviously Penn State doesn't have that big wide receiver one threat, and Tyler Warren is kind of the guy that you're depending on here, and defenses know that. Warren was he was like number 6 on the On3 Heisman poll, so he's already starting to get some buzz for that. Obviously I don't think he'll actually win the Heisman, but I think he could end up being a finalist in New York when in December. And I think just, his versatility and the way that Penn State chooses to use him and scheme him around the field and get him open and things like that makes him really difficult to stop. And I do think he is capable of kind of putting Penn State on his back. We've seen it a couple times now where regardless of how the defense plays him, he can just kind of put the team on his back and kind of will them to a win. Obviously, Drew Allar's not hesitant at all to throw to him, whether it's 17 targets or whatever in a game with a couple rushes and however else he's going to touch the ball. I don't think Penn State's hesitant at all to use him. And until someone proves that they can stop him, which, maybe you run into Georgia and all of a sudden they can stop him, that's certainly a possibility. But I think until someone can, prove that they can stop Tyler Warren, I think you just have to keep going to him and kind of put your trust in him to be able to carry this team. And I do think he can take them to one, maybe more playoff wins when the time comes.
What did you think of Luke Reynolds the other day? Joel put up some stats late in the game. I think a lot of people are going to be asking the question of what comes after Tyler Warren. Luke Reynolds, obviously the 5-star recruit coming in this season, lots of hype for him. Do you see him being able to step into certainly not the role that Tyler Warren has, created for himself, but can he be a really good tight end for Penn State next season if he gets more time with Tyler Warren moving on?
Yeah, definitely. I think if you're a Penn State fan right now and you're looking at the tight end room and you're worried about, where does Penn State go when Warren goes off to the NFL, I don't think you have any reason to be worried because of how well Penn State has recruited at the position. And James Franklin was asked about this and kind of used it as an opportunity to, plug the team and the position, what they've been able to do. And we're all familiar with, how many recent tight ends have gone off to the NFL between Freiermuth, Gesicki, Strange, Johnson last year, and then Tyler Warren this year. Obviously, it's just been a pipeline where, every starter for Penn State ends up going to the NFL. And I think Luke Reynolds obviously has the potential to be the next guy. I think the thing that's really promising about him is, out of this long stretch of Penn State tight ends over the last decade or so, he's been the highest rated recruit out of any of them. 247 Sports had Reynolds as a 5-star. I think in the composite, like the aggregate of all of the rankings, he was a high 4-star. But regardless, still, highly thought of and respected by the recruiting analysts. So obviously a very talented player. And, we kind of saw him flash a little bit with the touchdown on Saturday. But, I think obviously he has a very high ceiling. He's not going to be Tyler Warren because I think he's a little bit more of a traditional tight end where it's, blocking and catching and unfortunately not, running and throwing as well. But he's still, a very good player. And I think the future for Penn State at the tight end position looks bright. There's some other guys even in that room, whether it's Khalil Dinkins, who's been getting a lot of play this season, even if he's not necessarily touching the ball a lot. You've got Rappleyea in that room as well. You've got some other younger guys who are going to be fighting for playing time. I think it's a very deep room. And I think also what Tyler Warren has been able to do has kind of set the standard of, you can come in and not play much your first 1, 2, 3 years, and then all of a sudden have a breakout, 1 or 2 seasons at the end of your career and still put yourself in position to go to the NFL, which is great for Penn State because when the room is as deep as that, especially in the transfer portal era, there are players who are going to, not get a lot of playing time early and who are going to consider transferring. But Tyler Warren even said during media, I think it was last week, he got asked about it, and the team likes to do this thing where they bring up players to the front of the room and have them speak to the rest of the team, and whatever it may be, motivating advice or just kind of lessons, things like that. And they like to have some of the veterans and the leaders of the teams kind of stand up and do that. And Tyler Warren went to the front of the room and he told everyone in the room that when he was a freshman, when he was a sophomore, a younger guy at Penn State, he didn't even know if he was ever going to get playing time. And obviously to hear that coming from, Tyler Warren, who's now in the Heisman race technically, to hear him say that, he didn't even know if he was ever going to, start or play at Penn State. Obviously that's something that the younger guys can kind of take to heart and kind of really buy into that system of development and developing throughout the years. And I think Reynolds has kind of positioned himself as the next man up. I think it'll be a battle between him and Dinkins next year, if I had to guess, for that starting role, but he could certainly be another, star tight end to come out of Penn State.
Joel, you worried at all that they're putting a little too much on tape with Beau Pribula in these, kind of designed package situations? I'm not talking so much him playing at the end of the Purdue game or at the end of the Wisconsin game. Kind of in the normal course of play, he's taken every snap on those drives. I'm talking more when they've brought him in, for a snap or two and had him and Allar on the field at the same time. We've seen, a lot of it. Do you worry at all that you've put things on tape, and if you get into a playoff situation, and maybe, otherwise these teams would not be super familiar with Beau Pribula, but because you've done it so much, in Georgia or in Alabama or in Ole Miss, recognizes what Beau Pribula is capable of doing and maybe, is able to key on what the call is. Any thoughts on that? Because that's just something that came up in my head watching the game the other day.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with you there. Obviously they've had special packages for him for a couple years now. And I think what's interesting is, even against some of the inferior opponents, maybe Kent State or whoever, they'll still bring him in kind of early in the game. And to me, you're kind of questioning, like, why did you feel the need to get him involved so early? It wasn't, like he was coming in as a backup in garbage time. It was like, they kind of needed some kind of trickery. And, I didn't feel like they necessarily needed to use him in some of these games where they've brought him in. And to your point, it's definitely shown kind of a lot more than I think they needed to show. And the thing with, a potential playoff game is it's not just going to be 1 week of preparation. It's probably going to be a lot of time where, teams are going to be looking at, and especially based on the projections right now. I mean, I bet you teams are, a team like Georgia or Ole Miss, who's, kind of mocked in that range to potentially play against Penn State, are probably going to start to look at film even before the bracket is finalized, just to, they've got a huge staff of however many people who are probably going to start to, look into that film and break it down and start looking at Penn State, what Penn State's been doing, things like that. And teams are going to have a lot of time to prepare for this matchup. And, they're going to be digging into that film a lot more than they would for a normal regular season game. So they're obviously going to see Beau. They're going to see kind of the impact that he's had. I do think his extended run, especially against Wisconsin, where he was able to showcase the arm a lot, I do think that helps because, now hey, he does actually have an arm. He can actually throw the football. Like, we've seen it in a game, and we saw him be very effective. I think 11 for 13 against Wisconsin, and obviously played well against Purdue. I mean, the big play came with his legs. But I think they've done enough with that Wisconsin game specifically to show that, when Beau comes into the game, it doesn't necessarily mean a run, which, last year, anytime he came in, you knew it was going to be a run, whether it was him or whether it was handing it off. And I think this year you at least now have presented somewhat of a threat through the air where he's proven that he's capable of passing the ball if need be. And so that still makes things a little bit confusing because the defense isn't necessarily able to key in on the run, although they'll certainly be expecting it and might even, adjust their personnel to kind of be better at defending the run in those types of situations. But if you're Penn State, I think Beau Pribula is an asset, and he is something that not a lot of schools have right now. I mean, if you're ranking backup quarterbacks across the country, I mean, obviously you have to put Texas probably up there at number one with Arch Manning. But once you go past that, there's only a few other schools that I think could argue they have a better backup than Penn State does in Beau Pribula, who, could be starting at a lot of power conference schools right now. But he's just kind of a Penn State guy, went to Central York, pretty close by. And has just grown up as a Penn State fan his whole life, always wanted to play for Penn State. It's become pretty clear, through talking to him that he's just a guy that's passionate about the university. And as soon as he got, the offer to come here, that was really the only decision in his mind. And he's a guy that I don't think has ever even considered the possibility of transferring, despite, that probably being in his best interest if he wanted to go to the NFL or something like that and, actually put some stuff on tape and go to a program where he could start. At, probably a mid-tier power conference program, like, maybe a Maryland or something like that. I feel like he could probably earn the starting role there, but obviously he chose to stay at Penn State, and he is an asset for the Nittany Lions. It's just will they use him correctly, or are they going to get too cute? Because I felt like against Ohio State, they brought him in on like the 4th play or something like that. And I think it kind of killed the momentum a little bit, and they ended up kicking a field goal to close out that drive. I think Allar got a little bit cold because they went from Allar to Pribula, then to Tyler Warren taking a snap, and they were driving on that opening drive. It stalled out, and they kicked a field goal. I think you might be able to say that if Allar stays in for that whole drive, they score a touchdown on that first drive against Ohio State. So you can definitely misuse Pribula. If you put him in a situation where you're just kind of getting Allar out of rhythm. If Allar's playing well, I think you should keep him in there and just kind of let him cook and not worry about bringing in these special packages and getting cute. But if you need a spark, and nothing's working, that's I think the situation where you can bring Beau in. So it all comes down to how Penn State chooses to use him, which I think I got a little bit off track there. But to your point, I think I think he is a pretty valuable asset, and I think especially that game against Wisconsin showed that he's not just a runner, and so teams still have to be a little bit cautious when he comes in, and I don't think they can just kind of key in on what he does in the run game.
Well, and to your point, I think he's more than just a backup quarterback. You think of the backup as they're the replacement if this starting quarterback goes down. I think it's kind of an interesting parallel conversation with how the Steelers are using Justin Fields and the way they found plays for him this week against the Ravens. Will we see more of that from the Steelers? Will they kind of do what Penn State has done and have Beau Pribula in there? But it's kind of like a backup quarterback plus type of situation where, what they called it the lion roll with Tommy Stevens and them back in the day. I think that's probably a great description of, it's a little bit more than just a backup quarterback. So just a couple more playoff topics before we sign off here, Joel. Number one, if you look at some of these matchups, the potential matchups with these SEC opponents, I think it's becoming fairly likely, just in terms of the sheer volume of them that are at the, the 9, 10, 11, 12, range in the rankings, that you're going to see one of them. If you're Penn State, do you want to see Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, or Ole Miss? I'll go first. I think narrative-wise, I think you want to see Georgia and Alabama, because if you beat those games, then you get that monkey off of your back a little bit. And I think you're able to save face if you lose. I think losing to Ole Miss or losing to Tennessee would go down, would feel a lot worse for a lot of people. And I don't know that the Penn State matches up particularly well with either one, considering, especially in Ole Miss's case, we saw what they could do last season. Granted, Penn State didn't have, all their guys. There was a lot of opt-outs of the Peach Bowl situation, but we saw that matchup last year and it didn't go well for Penn State. So I think it's natural not to want to see Ole Miss this year.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that. I think Ole Miss is playing its best football right now, and it's obviously a very talented team. I think Ole Miss was number 6 in the preseason poll and then dropped a little bit. They had that bad loss. I think it was to Kentucky, but ever since that moment, and obviously they had the blowout against Georgia recently. Ever since then, they've been playing really well. And kind of position themselves for a potential Peach Bowl rematch. I think if you're Penn State, you're hoping to avoid that, just because of the way that Ole Miss is kind of built, the way that their team is and what their strengths are. And I think it can pose some matchup problems for Penn State. And I also just think there's a little bit less juice and less energy for a rematch of a game that we just saw last year. And Penn State fans probably aren't happy with the way that one played out. You could speculate about, what would have happened if there weren't so many opt-outs and things like that on Penn State's side. But regardless, at least in my mind, I don't view that as necessarily an exciting matchup. I think I agree with you about playing either Alabama or Georgia because of, the reputation that they have and kind of the status that they hold, that even if, and Alabama still could win the SEC, that's, still on the table right now. And that would obviously propel them up to a top 4 spot. But if they don't do that, and they finish whatever 3rd, 4th in the SEC and get one of those road games and come to Penn State, I think that could be dangerous. I think between the two, if you're Penn State, you would prefer to play Georgia. I think for a few reasons. When you look at the Bulldogs and kind of the struggles they've had at times this year, it's not just the losses. I mean, I think everyone watched that loss to Alabama, which was obviously a great game. But you look at that, you look at them getting blown out by Ole Miss and then even struggling against Kentucky. I think what the biggest issue for Georgia is, and they have some good wins as well, but I think their biggest issue is some inconsistent quarterback play from Carson Beck. I don't know if he still does, but I think a couple weeks ago he had thrown more interceptions than touchdowns, which is ridiculous from a team that, just won back-to-back natties a couple years ago. And if you're Penn State, playing Georgia still holds that reputation of this is a championship caliber program. But Carson Beck has been very inconsistent, and I think Penn State has always been a defense-led team. And obviously, you can talk about Tyler Warren, Drew Allar, Nick Singleton, whoever you want to talk about on the offense. And obviously there are playmakers there as well. But I think defense remains to be Penn State's strongest unit still. And I think that they can take advantage, especially on the defensive line, of kind of a shaky quarterback who at times has just looked confused. I think they would need to, start fast, and Tom Allen would have to get pretty creative with the things. Probably moving Abdul around the field could be a huge advantage for Penn State. But if that defensive line can kind of wreak havoc on, a mediocre Georgia offensive line that hasn't been as good as it was the previous few seasons, with a quarterback who's been shaky and I think sometimes it's a mental thing for him. And if Penn State can kind of get into his head and rattle Carson Beck, it should be, a long day for him. And I think that's Penn State's kind of key to victory if it were to host the Bulldogs. And obviously, getting that one in Beaver Stadium is a big advantage in December, especially for the defense, because, it tends to be a lower scoring affair when you have cold weather and things like that. And you're just, both teams kind of tend to run the ball a lot and things like that, which I think would play in Penn State's favor. And then obviously, you can't even imagine what that atmosphere would be like for, I assume it would be a whiteout in Beaver Stadium hosting Georgia. It would just be an incredible atmosphere. And I saw Brett McMurphy tweeted hypothetical lines basically of, potential matchups based on this week's college football playoff rankings, which would have Penn State hosting Georgia. And it was a pick 'em. There was no spread in either team's favor. Obviously, home field advantage, I think, factors into that. I think on a neutral site, Georgia's probably 2.5 point favorite, something like that. But regardless, it would be a good game. And I think Penn State's strengths, again, that defensive line, I think being a strength for Penn State could really help them win that game. And obviously from, a national perspective, if you want to bring up the narrative of, Franklin not having any big wins, that's about as big as it gets. So that would be, a huge factor for Penn State going into that one, and a huge win for the program.
Yeah, I wonder if it's I think it's a beauty in the eye of the beholder situation with Georgia, because I think you could make an argument that game could play out a lot like the Ohio State game did, where Penn State rattled Will Howard a little bit, had him play his worst game of the season, but Penn State's offense was not able to capitalize on that. I would expect the game to play out somewhat similarly, and the question would be, can Penn State make the plays against Georgia that it did not against Ohio State? Joel, wrap up on this. Obviously, the big game in the Big Ten this week is Indiana at Ohio State. Who are you rooting for as a Penn State fan? Is it Ohio State, to drop Indiana into the at-large pool? Maybe that's a team you get to Beaver Stadium. You've been able to handle them pretty well in recent years, and if Ohio State's able to beat them pretty badly, you could make a reasonable argument that Penn State will match up well with the Hoosiers. Or do you want Indiana to knock Ohio State out of the conference championship game, potentially put them in a game against an SEC opponent where maybe the foibles that Ryan Day has had lately come into play again, and maybe Ohio State gets eliminated rather than having a chance to win the Big Ten championship, get a top 4 seed, or maybe get that 5 seed where you get a pretty easy first round game, and then maybe even get a Boise State possibly in one of those semifinal or quarterfinal bowl games. What's your read on who you're rooting for? I think for me, I don't think there's any chance that if you knock Ohio State out of the Big Ten I don't think Penn State has a path to the Big Ten championship, is what I'm trying to say. And so I don't know if that really enters into my math, because that would require Indiana winning this week and then Indiana losing to Purdue, and I just don't see that.
Yeah. No, I think if you're a Penn State fan, I think what you have to root for is Ohio State here, and that just comes down to, your only losses to Ohio State. You don't play Indiana this year. And in terms of comparisons with both of those teams, you want Ohio State to be as high as it can be. I tend to believe that if Ohio State does make the Big Ten championship, they would beat Oregon in a rematch. That's just kind of my opinion on that. But I think if you're Penn State, you're rooting for Ohio State the rest of the way, because, a loss to the number whatever. I mean, if Ohio State does go on to win the Big Ten, they would probably be the number 1 team in the country. And then obviously Penn State's only loss was a very close one against the number 1 team. And then you look at, the Indiana situation. where obviously they played a pretty easy schedule to this point, and their resume wouldn't look great, especially if they get blown out by Ohio State. There's even been, talk about potentially the Hoosiers getting bounced from the playoff picture altogether with a loss, which, I don't personally agree with. But I think if you're Penn State and, if Indiana does beat Ohio State, then they all of a sudden leapfrog you in the standings. And now there's 3 Big Ten teams ranked ahead of Penn State. And it would be hard for Penn State at that point. You're looking at, potentially not even hosting a playoff game just because, just order of, transitive property there where, Oregon's ahead of Ohio State. Ohio State has also lost to Indiana, and Indiana would be unbeaten. So obviously there's 3 teams then above Penn State. Whereas, if Indiana loses to Ohio State, and especially if they lose by, more than 7, that would kind of be a pretty clear indicator that Penn State belongs above Indiana. So I think you're rooting for Ohio State so that A, your win looks better and then, or your loss looks better. And then B, just so that you can kind of have a sticking point of, clearly being above Indiana.
Yep, I think you're probably right there, Joel. All right, well, that's all we have for you guys this week. I will be back Thursday evening for our post-game live stream after Thursday Night Football, Steelers versus Browns. It'll be myself and Paul Zeiss, so make sure you're subscribed for that. Also, make sure you subscribe for everything we're going to have coming your way after Steelers Browns. Jerry Dulac and Ray Fittipaldo up in Cleveland. Then I believe I'll be hosting the North Shore Drive on Friday with Brian Bacco. So plenty of reaction. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you like this video if you enjoyed it. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm. Always helps for Penn State fans in this sea of black and gold and a little blue and gold for Pitt. So if you enjoyed us, help us out a little bit. We always appreciate that. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.